"You don't need this room anymore," my daughter-in-law said 3 days after my husband's funeral. She said it softly. That was what made it worse. Not with shouting. Not with anger. Not even with embarrassment. Vanessa stood in the doorway of my bedroom wearing one of Richard's old robes, the navy one he used to put on every winter morning before making coffee, and spoke as if she were telling me the mail had arrived. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there with my overnight bag still hanging from my shoulder, my black funeral dress wrinkled from spending 2 nights at my sister Elaine's house, and stared at the room where I had slept beside my husband for 38 years. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me what city you're watching from." I never imagined that at 71 years old, after burying the man I loved, I would have to learn how quietly a family can erase you. The funeral flowers were still in the hallway. White lilies. Pale roses. Baby's breath beginning to brown at the edges. That heavy sweet smell still hung in the air, the kind that follows grief around a house after everyone else has gone home. Richard had been buried only 72 hours earlier, beneath a gray Connecticut sky, with rain gathering on the shoulders of Daniel's suit. My son had held my arm at the cemetery. Vanessa had held his. I remembered noticing that even then. At the time, I told myself I was being unfair. Grief makes a woman notice strange things. It makes ordinary gestures look like betrayals. So when Vanessa leaned against Daniel under the black umbrella, her gloved hand wrapped tightly around his elbow, I told myself she was only trying to comfort him. I told myself many things that week. That was how I survived it. When I came home that afternoon, the house was too quiet. No television from the den. No sound of Richard clearing his throat from his chair. No kettle whistling in the kitchen. Only the faint sound of drawers opening and closing upstairs. I climbed slowly, holding the banister Richard had polished every spring. My knees hurt. My chest felt hollow. At 71, grief does not simply break your heart. It settles into your joints, your hands, your breathing. The bedroom door was half open. Inside, Vanessa was humming. Not loudly. Just a little tune under her breath while she folded a cream-colored sweater and placed it inside my dresser drawer. My drawer. For a moment, I thought I had walked into the wrong room. My wedding photo was gone from the dresser. Richard's slippers were no longer beside the bed. The quilt I had washed myself after the ambulance took him away had been replaced by an ivory comforter I had never seen before. Vanessa's perfume floated over everything, clean and expensive, covering the faint trace of Richard's cedar aftershave. She turned when she saw me. "Oh," she said. "You're back." Not sorry. Not surprised. Just back. I looked past her into the closet. My dresses had been pushed to one side. Vanessa's coats hung in the center, arranged by color. Her shoes lined the bottom shelf where Richard used to keep his old leather boots. "What is this?" I asked. My voice sounded thin. Vanessa smoothed the sleeve of Richard's robe as if she had every right to wear it. "Daniel and I talked," she said. "This room just makes more sense for us now." More sense? She gave me that careful smile she used in public, the one that never reached her eyes. "You'll be more comfortable downstairs. The guest room is closer to the kitchen. And honestly, Margaret, the stairs aren't ideal for someone your age." Someone your age. 3 days after burying my husband, I had become a safety concern. I turned and saw Daniel standing near the bathroom door, his hands buried in the pockets of his sweatshirt. My son. The boy I had once carried through fever nights. The boy Richard taught to ride a bike in the driveway. The man who now could not look me in the eye. "Daniel?" I said. He shifted his weight. "Mom, it's temporary." Temporary. That word sat between us like a cold plate of food no one wanted to touch. "Vanessa thought it might help everyone adjust," he added. I almost asked him who everyone was. Because Richard was gone. And no one had asked me. I walked farther into the room, slowly, as if any sudden movement might make the walls collapse. Richard's nightstand was empty. His reading glasses were gone. The paperback mystery novel he had been halfway through before the heart attack was missing. Then I noticed the top shelf of the closet. The wooden box was gone. Richard's watch box. My stomach tightened. "Where are your father's watches?" I asked. Daniel's face changed. "Only slightly. But I saw it." Vanessa answered before he could. "I put some valuables away for safekeeping," she said. "There have been so many people in and out of the house." I nodded. Not because I believed her. Because I needed one more second before my face betrayed me. Richard never let anyone touch those watches. Not because they were expensive, though some of them were. Because each one held a story. His retirement watch. His father's old gold watch. The silver one Daniel gave him after getting his first real paycheck. And the antique gold one Richard once told our grandson would be his someday. I looked toward the bed. Vanessa's handbag sat open on the ivory comforter. Inside, half covered by a silk scarf, I saw the edge of a gold watch. Richard's watch. My hands went cold. For one terrible moment, I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear open that handbag, hold up the watch, and ask my son what kind of man lets his wife steal from his dead father before the funeral flowers have even wilted. But I did not scream. Women my age learn the cost of screaming. People stop hearing the words and only remember the noise. So I stood there quietly. Vanessa watched me. Daniel looked at the floor. And in that silence I understood something I had not been ready to understand. This had not begun today. It had not begun when Richard died. It had been waiting. Planning. Making room for itself in my house, in my marriage, in my son's heart. Vanessa tilted her head. "The downstairs room is already made up for you," she said gently. "Guest room. In my own home." I tightened my fingers around the strap of my overnight bag until the leather bit into my palm. Then I looked once more at the bed Richard had died in, the closet where his shirts had hung, the dresser where our wedding photo used to stand. "I see," I said. That was all. I turned before either of them could see my eyes. "Phil." As I reached the hallway, I heard Vanessa behind me. "Margaret?" I stopped. Her voice was still soft. "Try not to make this harder than it has to be." I did not turn around. Because right then, with Richard's watch hidden in her handbag and my son standing silent behind her, I realized something that frightened me more than grief. Vanessa was not just taking my room. She was testing how much of me she could remove before I finally made a sound. That night, I slept in the guest room. At least, I tried to. Sleep and grief have never been good companions. Every time I drifted off, I woke again a few minutes later, confused by the unfamiliar ceiling above me and the absence beside me. For 38 years, Richard had occupied the right side of our bed. Even after he retired, he still woke before sunrise. Every morning, I would hear the same routine. The bathroom faucet. The coffee grinder. The floorboards creaking beneath his slippers. A marriage that long becomes a collection of sounds. And when those sounds disappear, silence becomes its own kind of noise. The guest room sat at the back of the house, near the kitchen. According to Vanessa, it was more practical. The room itself wasn't unpleasant. Pale walls. A small window overlooking the side yard. A narrow bed that had once belonged to Daniel when he was in college. But it wasn't mine. Nothing in it belonged to my life with Richard. No photographs. No memories. No traces of 42 years. Just a bed. A dresser. And the feeling that I had somehow become a visitor in my own home. Around 2 a.m, rain began tapping softly against the window. I sat up and wrapped Richard's old gray cardigan around my shoulders. I had found it folded inside one of the boxes Vanessa had pushed into the guest room earlier that evening. The fabric still carried the faint scent of cedar and aftershave. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I could almost imagine Richard sitting beside me. Not speaking. Just being there. That had always been one of his gifts. Richard never rushed to fill silence. He understood that sometimes comfort came from simply sharing it. A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it. The first one all day. Not because of Vanessa. Not because of the bedroom. Because suddenly I remembered a rainy night nearly 30 years earlier. The house had still been unfinished then. The kitchen cabinets weren't installed. The living room contained nothing but cardboard boxes. Daniel was 11 years old and racing through empty rooms pretending to defend a castle. Richard and I sat on overturned paint buckets eating Chinese takeout directly from the cartons. I had worried constantly back then. About money. About mortgages. About repairs. About raising a child. Richard just laughed. "Margaret," he said, pointing his chopsticks at me, "one day this house is going to hold every memory our family ever makes." I smiled at the memory. Then the smile faded. Because he had been right. Every memory was here. And now someone was trying to convince me I no longer belonged among them. I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep shortly before dawn. The next morning, I woke to unfamiliar voices. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I heard Vanessa laughing upstairs. The sound instantly brought everything back. Richard was gone. The bedroom was gone. My life had changed. I dressed slowly and walked toward the kitchen. The house already smelled different. Not bad. Just different. Vanessa had lit one of her scented candles. Vanilla and citrus. It covered the familiar smells that had lived in the house for decades. Fresh coffee. Wood polish. Richard's pipe tobacco from years ago. Even the kitchen looked altered. Several framed family photographs had disappeared from the countertops. The ceramic rooster cookie jar Richard bought during a road trip through Pennsylvania was gone. In its place sat a decorative bowl filled with white stones. White stones. I stared at them longer than I should have. It was ridiculous, really. Just a bowl. Just decorations. But grief magnifies small things. Every object becomes evidence. Every change feels personal. Vanessa stood at the counter pouring almond milk into her coffee. She smiled when she saw me. "Good morning." I nodded. "Morning." Daniel sat at the table scrolling through his phone. He looked tired. Guilty, maybe. Or perhaps I only wanted him to look guilty. I wasn't sure anymore. That uncertainty bothered me. Because for most of my life, I had trusted my instincts. Now I questioned everything. Maybe Vanessa wasn't trying to hurt me. Maybe she genuinely believed she was helping. Maybe I was allowing grief to distort ordinary events into something darker. Widowhood does strange things to the mind. You begin doubting your own perceptions. Searching for reasons. Excuses. Anything that hurts less than the truth. Vanessa set a mug in front of me. "I made tea." "Thank you." She sat down. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Rain drummed softly against the windows. The refrigerator hummed. Daniel scrolled. Then Vanessa said something that made my stomach tighten. "By the way, the cleaning company is coming tomorrow." I looked up. "Cleaning company?" "The house needs refreshing." She spoke casually. Like someone discussing weather. "There are a lot of old things collecting dust. I thought brighter furniture and lighter colors might help everyone move forward." Move forward. Richard had not even been buried a full week. His reading glasses were probably still sitting inside a drawer somewhere. The indentation from his favorite chair likely remained in the living room rug. Yet Vanessa was already redesigning our life. I stared into my tea. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she was grieving too. Maybe, no. Even my own thoughts sounded weak. After breakfast, I wandered into the den. At least I intended to. But when I reached the doorway, I stopped. Richard's leather chair was gone. The chair where he spent every Sunday reading newspapers. The chair where he fell asleep during baseball games. The chair where he held our first grandchild. Gone. The knitted blanket his mother made decades ago had disappeared too. In their place sat decorative cream-colored pillows arranged so neatly they looked uncomfortable. I stood there without moving. The room felt staged. Like a model home. Beautiful. Empty. Wrong. A few minutes later, voices drifted from the dining room. Vanessa. Daniel. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I simply froze when I heard the word. Realtor. My pulse quickened. I remained hidden near the hallway. The realtor said spring listings are moving faster than expected, Vanessa said quietly. A long pause followed. Then Daniel answered. Mom is still fragile. Fragile. The word stung. I pressed my hand against the wall. You saw how she reacted yesterday. Vanessa lowered her voice. Daniel, this house is too much for her now. Silence. Then, the stairs are dangerous. Another pause. There are wonderful assisted living communities. The air left my lungs. Assisted living. I closed my eyes. Not because there was anything wrong with assisted living. There wasn't. Several friends of mine lived in wonderful communities. But this wasn't concern. This was planning. Richard had been gone 6 days. 6. And they were already discussing where to put me. The conversation continued. Words like, practical. Safer. Future. Maintenance. The language people use when they want something to sound compassionate. I backed away quietly before they could see me. For the rest of the afternoon, I stayed downstairs. Reading without reading. Watching television without watching. Thinking. Mostly thinking. That evening, I began unpacking some of the boxes stacked inside the guest room. Many contained random household items. Photo albums. Books. Kitchen towels. The careless collection of things people pack when they're in a hurry. Then I noticed one box near the closet. Large. Plain. Marked with thick black letters. I crouched beside it. And felt something cold settle deep inside me. Only one word had been written across the side. Margaret. Not Mom. Not family keepsakes. Not personal items. Just, Margaret. As if I had already become separate from the family itself. As if I were an inventory category. I stared at the label for a long time. Then I noticed something else. A folded business card taped to the top. I pulled it free. A local real estate office. On the back, written in blue ink, Friday, 2 p.m. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. The room suddenly felt smaller. The rain had started again outside. Soft. Steady. Relentless. And for the first time since Richard's funeral, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. Because whatever Daniel and Vanessa were planning, it was already moving forward. With me. Or without me. I didn't tell anyone about the realtor's card. Not my sister Elaine. Not Daniel. Certainly not Vanessa. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan and carried it around with me for the rest of the day like a secret I wasn't ready to name. Because naming something makes it real. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. For nearly a week after Richard's funeral, I had been living inside a fog of grief. Every morning, I woke up expecting to hear his footsteps. Every evening, I found myself glancing toward his chair before remembering it was gone. The house no longer felt familiar. But it also didn't feel completely lost. Not yet. Part of me still believed there had to be an explanation. Maybe Vanessa was moving too quickly because she didn't know how to handle grief. Maybe Daniel was overwhelmed. Maybe I was seeing cruelty where there was only thoughtlessness. There is a difference. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The problem was that every day brought another small change. Another piece removed. Another memory packed away. Another reminder that Richard's absence was creating space for someone else's plans. The following morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet. For a few precious moments, I forgot everything. Then I heard footsteps overhead. The master bedroom. My bedroom. The sound stopped me cold. I sat upright in bed. For a second, my heart actually jumped. Richard. The thought arrived before reason could catch it. Then reality returned. Richard was gone. And someone else was walking across our floor. I lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. The grief hurt. But something else had begun growing beside it. Something colder. Something sharper. Unease. After dressing, I walked outside. The Connecticut morning carried the damp chill of early spring. The hydrangeas along the front walkway hadn't bloomed yet. Their bare branches looked fragile against the gray sky. Richard planted those hydrangeas 27 years ago. Every spring, he trimmed them himself. Every summer, he stood back and admired them as though he'd painted each flower by hand. I touched one of the branches gently. "You'd hate what's happening in there," I whispered. The words escaped before I could stop them. Talking to someone after they're gone feels strange. Yet lately, I found myself doing it often. Perhaps grief is simply love with nowhere left to go. I stayed outside for nearly an hour. Long enough to avoid breakfast. Long enough to postpone seeing Vanessa. Eventually, though, I had to go back inside. The moment I stepped through the front door, I smelled fresh paint. My stomach sank. Vanessa stood in the hallway holding color samples. "Good morning," she said brightly. I looked at the cards in her hand. Soft beige. Warm ivory. Light gray. Colors designed to erase history. "What's this?" I asked. "Oh, just ideas." She smiled. "The house feels a little dark." "The house." "Not your house." "Not our house." "The house." I nodded and continued upstairs without another word. At the top of the staircase, I paused. The master bedroom door was closed. A simple thing. A closed door. But for nearly 4 decades, that door had never been closed to me. Now I hesitated before touching the handle. Then I stopped myself. What was I doing? The room wasn't mine anymore. At least not in practice. That realization hurt more than I expected. I turned away and walked toward Richard's study instead. Or what used to be Richard's study. Unlike the rest of the house, the room appeared untouched. Dust floated through shafts of morning sunlight. His desk remained where he'd left it. His reading lamp. His framed navy photograph. His old leather-bound planner. The sight nearly brought me to tears. For the first time in days, I felt close to him. Safe. I sat in his chair. The leather creaked beneath me. Richard always said the chair sounded older than both of us combined. I smiled faintly. Then my eyes landed on something unusual. One of the desk drawers wasn't completely closed. That caught my attention immediately. Richard was meticulous. Obsessively neat. Every drawer closed. Every file labeled. Every pen returned to its proper place. An open drawer was unusual. I leaned forward and pulled it open. Inside sat several folders. Tax documents. Insurance papers. Property records. Nothing surprising. Then I noticed a plain white envelope tucked beneath a stack of folders. No stamp. No address. Just 3 words written in Richard's familiar handwriting. If anything changes, I froze. The room suddenly felt very still. I picked up the envelope carefully. The paper looked old. Not years old. But certainly not recent. The handwriting was unmistakable. Richard's. My fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear. From anticipation. The kind you feel before opening a door that might change everything behind it. For several seconds, I simply stared. Then I set the envelope back down. I couldn't do it. Not yet. Opening it felt strangely final. As though whatever existed inside would permanently divide my life into before and after. Instead, I leaned back in the chair and looked around the room. Every object carried memories. The fishing photograph from Maine. The brass clock Daniel gave him for Father's Day. The baseball signed by a Hartford player 30 years ago. A life reduced to artifacts. My eyes drifted toward the bookshelf. There, tucked between two history books, sat a faded photograph. I pulled it free. Daniel at 16. Standing beside Richard in the driveway. Both smiling. Both holding snow shovels. I remembered that winter. One of the worst snowstorms we'd ever had. Daniel complained the entire weekend. Richard loved every minute of it. They spent 2 days clearing driveways for elderly neighbors who couldn't manage it themselves. Looking at the photograph now, I felt a fresh ache. When had that boy disappeared? Not overnight. That much was obvious. The changes happened gradually. Holiday visits became shorter. Phone calls became less frequent. Conversations became more careful. Then Vanessa arrived. At first, I liked her. Honestly. I did. She was intelligent. Polished. Confident. Everything Daniel seemed drawn to. The distance didn't appear immediately. It happened slowly enough that I barely noticed. Like watching daylight fade. You don't realize darkness has arrived until suddenly it's night. A knock at the study door startled me. I quickly slipped the envelope back into the drawer. Daniel stood there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted. Older than 43. The grief had affected him too. I reminded myself of that. It was important not to forget. Mom. Hi. His eyes moved around the room. Been spending time in Dad's office? I nodded. It's one of the few places that still feels like him. A shadow crossed his face. Guilt. Regret. Something. Then it vanished. I miss him too. The words sounded sincere. That was what made everything so confusing. Because Daniel wasn't cruel. Not openly. Not intentionally. He wasn't Vanessa. He wasn't plotting. He wasn't pushing. He was simply allowing things to happen. And sometimes that kind of betrayal hurts most of all. I studied him quietly. My father used to say something, I said. Daniel looked up. What? The easiest way to lose something valuable is to assume it'll always be there. A long silence followed. I watched the meaning settle somewhere behind his eyes. Whether it stayed there, I couldn't tell. Finally, he nodded. I should get back to work. Of course. He left. The room fell silent again. I waited until his footsteps disappeared down the hallway. Then I reopened the drawer. The envelope waited exactly where I'd left it. This time, I picked it up. And turned it over. The seal had never been broken. I slid my thumb beneath the flap. Then stopped. Because something else had caught my eye. A small business card attached to the back with an old paper clip. The name printed across it made my heart skip. Martin Keegan, attorney at law. Richard's attorney. Richard's friend. A man I hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 years. Beneath the card, written in Richard's handwriting, was a single sentence. If anything ever feels wrong, call Martin first. I stared at the words for a very long time. Then I looked toward the closed study door. Toward the unfamiliar house. Toward the future I no longer trusted. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt afraid. Because deep down, I was beginning to suspect that Richard had known something I didn't. And whatever it was, he had tried to prepare me for it. For a long time, I simply sat there holding the envelope. The study was quiet except for the soft ticking of the brass clock on Richard's bookshelf. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere downstairs, I could hear cabinet doors opening and closing. Vanessa. Even from another room, I seemed to recognize her presence now. Not by sound. By what followed it. Something moved. Something changed. Something disappeared. I turned the envelope over again. If anything changes. The words looked strange in Richard's handwriting. Not because they were unfamiliar. Because they sounded cautious. Richard was many things during the 42 years I knew him. Patient. Steady. Practical. But rarely cautious. He was the sort of man who fixed problems before they became problems. The sort of husband who carried jumper cables in his trunk, extra batteries in a drawer, and emergency cash tucked inside an old coffee tin in the garage. He prepared for storms. He didn't usually worry about people. At least, I thought he didn't. My thumb slid beneath the flap. The seal opened with a soft crackle. A single folded letter rested inside. Nothing else. No legal documents. No property records. No instructions. Just a letter. For a second, disappointment washed over me. Then I unfolded it. The date in the corner caught my attention immediately. It had been written nearly 11 months earlier. Long before Richard's heart attack. Long before the funeral. Long before my world fell apart. I began reading. My Margaret, if you're reading this, something has changed. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope this letter stays buried in my desk forever and you never need to see it. But if life has taught me anything, it's that hoping isn't the same thing as preparing. I stopped. The words blurred slightly. I blinked and continued. First, let me tell you something I should probably tell you more often. Thank you. For every ordinary day. For every meal. For every difficult year. For every time you stood beside me when standing beside me wasn't easy. A tear slipped down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly. Richard had never been a man of grand speeches. He showed love through actions. Fixing loose cabinet hinges. Bringing me coffee on Sunday mornings. Leaving notes beside the toaster when he left early. Reading those words felt like hearing his voice again. For a moment, I forgot why I had opened the letter. Then I reached the next section. The older I get, the more I realize something uncomfortable. Growing old changes how people see you. Not everyone. But some people. You become someone they worry about. Then someone they speak for. Then sometimes someone they stop listening to altogether. I frowned. Richard had never spoken that way before. At least not openly. I kept reading. You've always been stronger than you think. Stronger than our son believes. Stronger than some people may give you credit for one day. My eyes lingered on that sentence. Stronger than our son believes. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Not fear. Recognition. Richard had noticed things. Things I had ignored. Things I had explained away. Daniel has a good heart. But a good heart isn't the same thing as a strong spine. I stared at those words. Then read them again. A memory surfaced immediately. 10 years earlier. Daniel had accepted blame for a mistake made by a coworker because he didn't want confrontation. 3 years later, he let a neighbor repeatedly borrow expensive tools without returning them because he felt uncomfortable asking. Even as a child, Daniel hated conflict. Richard used to worry about that. I never did. I thought kindness would protect him. Now I wasn't so sure. I continued reading. If you're reading this because life has become complicated after I'm gone, don't let anyone rush you. Not decisions. Not grief. Not your future. People mean well. Sometimes they don't. Either way, pressure often arrives disguised as concern. My chest tightened. Pressure disguised as concern. I thought of Vanessa. The guest room. The stairs. The assisted living communities. The safety concerns. The practical solutions. Every conversation suddenly sounded different. I shifted uncomfortably in Richard's chair. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe not. For the first time, I wasn't sure. The letter continued. If anything ever feels wrong, trust yourself. You have spent a lifetime taking care of other people. Don't forget that you deserve the same care in return. I lowered the paper. The room felt strangely warm. For nearly a week, I had questioned every instinct. Every reaction. Every hurt feeling. Every suspicion. Perhaps because grief makes you distrust your own judgment. Perhaps because I wanted so badly to believe my family would never intentionally hurt me. But Richard seemed to be telling me the exact opposite. Trust yourself. The words lingered. After a moment, I resumed reading. And if anything ever feels truly wrong, call Martin. Before making decisions. Before signing anything. Before agreeing to anything important. Promise me that. There it was again. Martin. Not once. Twice. I frowned. Richard wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't repeat himself without reason. Why was Martin so important? The answer wasn't in the letter. At least not directly. The final paragraph was brief. Painfully brief. If you're reading this because I'm gone, then I'm sorry. Not for dying. That part belongs to all of us eventually. I'm sorry for leaving you to carry the weight alone. But remember something. A lifetime doesn't disappear because one person does. Everything we built together still exists. Including you. Love always, Richard. For several minutes, I couldn't move. The rain continued outside. The clock ticked steadily. The letter rested in my lap. I missed him. God, I missed him. Not the grand moments. Not the anniversaries. Not the vacations. I missed ordinary Richard. The man who complained about grocery prices. The man who pretended not to cry during movies. The man who always left one light on when I came home after dark. 42 years creates thousands of tiny memories. And grief turns every one of them into an ache. Eventually, I folded the letter carefully. My hands felt steadier than they had in days. Not healed. Not even close. But steadier. Then my eyes landed on the business card attached to the back of the envelope. Martin Keegan. The card looked old. Slightly yellowed at the edges. Richard had clearly placed it there intentionally. I turned it over. On the back, in Richard's handwriting, was another note. A short one. Only 7 words. He knows things I never told you. A chill ran through me. I read the sentence. Again. Then again. He knows things I never told you. What things? About Richard? About our finances? About Daniel? About the house? The questions arrived all at once. And suddenly the study no longer felt peaceful. It felt unfinished. Like a conversation interrupted halfway through. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the hydrangea bushes swayed in the wind. Richard planted them nearly 3 decades ago. Back when we still believed the hardest years of life were behind us. I wrapped my arms around myself. Then I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not a brave one. Just a necessary one. I would call Martin. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. Because for the first time since Richard died, I no longer felt like a grieving widow simply struggling to survive. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a truth she didn't yet understand. And deep down, I suspected Richard had left that envelope because he knew one day I would need more than memories. I would need answers. And somewhere beyond that rain-soaked afternoon, Martin Keegan was holding the first piece of them. I stared at Martin Keegan's business card for nearly an hour before I finally picked up the phone. Not because I was afraid of Martin. Because I was afraid of what he might confirm. As long as I hadn't made the call, there was still room for doubt. Room for innocent explanations. Room for the comforting possibility that grief was distorting everything. Once I spoke to him, that possibility might disappear. The house was quiet that afternoon. Daniel had gone back to work. Vanessa was out somewhere. Shopping, I assumed. She had developed a sudden enthusiasm for replacing things lately. Furniture. Curtains. Photographs. Anything that carried Richard's fingerprints seemed to vanish one piece at a time. I sat at the small desk in the guest room and dialed the number. The phone rang twice. Then a familiar voice answered. Martin Keegan. I hadn't heard his voice in years. Yet I recognized it immediately. Steady. Measured. The kind of voice people trust. Martin? A brief pause. Then, Margaret? His tone changed instantly. Warmer. Concerned. Margaret Whitmore? Yes. My God. The silence that followed felt unexpectedly emotional. Richard and Martin had known each other for more than 30 years. Fishing trips. Golf outings. Late-night phone calls about business problems. For a long time I had considered Martin part of our extended family. How are you holding up? He asked quietly. Nobody had asked me that in days. Not really. Most people asked how I was doing because they felt obligated. Martin sounded like he actually wanted the answer. I looked toward the window. I'm not sure. His sigh was soft. Neither was I after Ellen passed. I remembered his wife. She had died nearly a decade earlier. Cancer. The memory made me feel slightly less alone. For several minutes, we talked about Richard. Not legal matters. Not paperwork. Just Richard. The way he laughed. The terrible fishing stories he exaggerated every year. The time he nearly set his grill on fire trying to impress neighbors. I found myself smiling. Then crying. Then smiling again. Grief is strange that way. Eventually, Martin's voice became more serious. What made you call? I swallowed. And suddenly all the careful explanations I had prepared seemed inadequate. I found a letter. Another pause. I wondered if you might. That caught my attention. Might? Richard mentioned it. My pulse quickened. He did? Several times. The room seemed to grow smaller. I tightened my grip on the phone. Martin. Yes? Why did Richard leave that letter? A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Careful. Measured. The silence of a man choosing his words. Finally he spoke. Before I answer that, I need to ask you something. Something in his tone made me sit straighter. What? His voice softened. Has anyone asked you to leave the house yet? The question hit me harder than I expected. I looked down at the carpet. At the boxes. At the life that had been quietly relocated downstairs. No. The lie came automatically. The moment it left my mouth, I regretted it. Martin didn't respond immediately. Then he sighed. Margaret. I closed my eyes. He knew. Of course he knew. The same way Richard would have known. After 40 years of marriage, some people learn to hear what isn't being said. I've known you a long time, Martin continued gently. You only use that voice when you're protecting someone. Tears stung my eyes. And suddenly I was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of explaining things away. Tired of defending people who weren't defending me. So I told him. Not everything. Just enough. The bedroom. The guest room. The realtor card. The conversations about assisted living. The changes throughout the house. When I finished speaking, Martin remained silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that tells you more than words. Martin? I'm here. You don't sound surprised. Another pause. Then, I'm not. A chill moved through me. What does that mean? His answer came slowly. Richard worried about many things before he died. I stared at the wall. Worried about Vanessa? No. That surprised me. Then what? He worried about what grief does to people. I frowned. I don't understand. Grief creates vulnerability. His voice remained calm. Not just for widows. For entire families. I thought about Daniel. About the funeral. About the exhaustion hanging over all of us. Martin continued. People make rushed decisions after loss. Emotional decisions. Financial decisions. Family decisions. The words sounded reasonable. Logical. Yet something felt unfinished. Like he was walking around the center of the conversation instead of through it. Martin. Yes? What aren't you telling me? He chuckled softly. Richard used to do the same thing whenever I asked a question he wasn't ready to answer. That realization hurt more than I expected. Some things need to be reviewed first. Reviewed? Documents. My stomach tightened. What documents? Estate documents. I stood. The sudden movement startled even me. Is there a problem with Richard's estate? No. His answer came immediately. Too immediately. There isn't a problem. Then why review anything? Martin hesitated. Because I'd rather deal with facts than assumptions. I sat back down. Part of me wanted to push harder. Demand answers. But another part recognized something familiar. Professional caution. Richard respected that quality in people. Perhaps that was why he trusted Martin. What do you need from me? I asked. For now? Yes. Nothing. That answer surprised me. Nothing? I'll review everything myself. The room fell quiet. Rain had started outside again. A steady rhythm against the window. Finally Martin spoke. Margaret. Yes? Do not sign anything. I felt my heartbeat accelerate. What kind of things? Any documents. Any agreements. Any housing paperwork. Any transfers. Anything. The seriousness in his voice made my mouth go dry. I wasn't planning to. Good. The single word carried unusual weight. Then he added something that stayed with me long after the call ended. People often mistake patience for weakness. I thought immediately of Richard. Then of myself. Then of Vanessa. Richard never made that mistake, Martin said quietly. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened. Not because I had learned new information. Because I hadn't. Not really. Martin had revealed almost nothing. And yet everything felt different. The letter. The warnings. The repeated mention of documents. The urgency behind his calm demeanor. It all pointed toward something larger. Something still hidden. That evening, Vanessa returned carrying shopping bags. She seemed cheerful. Almost energized. I watched her from the kitchen doorway as she unpacked decorative items for the living room. New picture frames. New candles. New throw pillows. She looked like someone preparing for a future she already considered certain. For the first time, I wondered whether certainty could be dangerous. Because confidence often comes from assumptions. And assumptions are only useful when they're true. Late that night, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Martin's name. I answered immediately. Martin? His voice sounded different this time. Less relaxed. More focused. Margaret. My stomach dropped. What is it? For several seconds, I heard nothing but his breathing. Then he said, I reviewed the first set of records. I gripped the phone tighter. And? Another pause. Long enough to make my pulse race. Then, someone requested copies of Richard's estate documents last week. I froze. The room suddenly felt cold. Who? I don't know yet. The silence stretched between us. Then Martin spoke again. And the words sent a chill through my entire body. But I can tell you one thing. What? The request didn't come from you. And for the first time since Richard's funeral, I realized this situation might be far bigger than a bedroom. I barely slept after Martin's phone call. The rain continued through most of the night, tapping softly against the guest room window like impatient fingers. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself replaying the same sentence. Someone requested copies of Richard's estate documents. Not you. The words echoed through my mind. At 3 a.m, I got out of bed and walked quietly into the kitchen. The house was dark. For a moment, it almost felt like the old days. The way it used to be when Richard couldn't sleep. I'd often find him standing at the kitchen counter in his robe, eating a bowl of cereal while pretending he wasn't worried about something. When I'd ask what was wrong, he'd always smile and say, "Nothing, that looks better in daylight." I used to laugh at that. Now I understood it. Some fears grow larger in darkness. The kitchen clock read 3:17 a.m. I wrapped my hands around a mug of tea and stared out at the backyard. The swing set Daniel had played on was long gone. The vegetable garden Richard loved had become overgrown. Time changes everything eventually. The question was whether change happened naturally. Or because someone forced it. By morning, I still had no answers. Only questions. And questions can become exhausting. Especially when grief is already consuming most of your energy. When I came downstairs later that morning, Vanessa was sitting at the dining room table with a laptop. She quickly lowered the screen when she saw me. Too quickly. The movement lasted less than a second. But I noticed. At 71, you become skilled at noticing things people assume you won't. Not because you're suspicious. Because people stop trying to hide things from older women. They begin treating you like furniture. Part of the room. Present but irrelevant. Good morning, Vanessa said brightly. Morning. She smiled. Did you sleep okay? The concern sounded genuine. That was the confusing part. Vanessa rarely sounded cruel. People like her rarely do. The most effective manipulators seldom raise their voices. They simply make decisions and present them as kindness. I poured coffee and sat across from her. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she turned the laptop slightly away from me. Just enough. A small movement. Almost invisible. Almost. My stomach tightened. Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe it didn't. A week earlier, I would have ignored it. Now I found myself paying attention. Big plans today? She asked. Not really. Good. The word arrived too quickly. She smiled again. I mean, you've been through a lot. I nodded. There it was. Concern. Care. Compassion. Wrapped around control. A familiar pattern was beginning to emerge. Before I could respond, Daniel entered the room. His tie was crooked. His eyes looked tired. For a brief second, he reminded me of himself at 17 before a difficult exam. Vulnerable. Uncertain. Human. Morning, Mom. Morning. He kissed the top of my head. The gesture surprised me. It had been years since he'd done that. A sudden ache formed in my chest. Because for a moment, I saw the boy I raised. Not the man who stood silently while his wife moved into my bedroom. The boy. Sometimes that's the cruelest part of motherhood. You never stop seeing both versions at once. Daniel grabbed coffee. Vanessa immediately stood and adjusted his tie. The movement was intimate. Automatic. Practiced. I watched them quietly. And for the first time I began noticing something Richard used to mention occasionally. Vanessa rarely influenced Daniel through arguments. She influenced him through certainty. She always sounded sure. Always had a plan. Always knew the answer. Daniel, meanwhile, hated uncertainty. Hated conflict. Hated difficult choices. When two people like that build a life together, one eventually starts making decisions for both. The realization stayed with me long after they left. Later that afternoon, Martin called again. This time, he sounded more prepared. How are you holding up? I've been better. That's fair. I smiled despite myself. Martin always spoke like a man who had spent 40 years calming nervous clients. He didn't waste words. And he never dramatized things. Which was why his next statement immediately caught my attention. I learned something interesting. My pulse quickened. What? The estate request. I sat down immediately. What about it? It wasn't unusual. I blinked. What? The request itself. Martin paused. Family members request copies of estate documents all the time. Confusion washed over me. Then why did you sound concerned? Because of timing. The knot in my stomach returned. Timing? Richard wasn't even buried yet. The room suddenly felt colder. I stared at the wall. Not buried yet. The phrase settled heavily inside me. Who requests estate paperwork before the funeral? Martin asked quietly. Neither of us answered. We didn't need to. The question itself was enough. A long silence followed. Then Martin changed direction unexpectedly. Margaret. Yes? What do you think Vanessa believes? The question surprised me. I don't understand. About the house. I considered it. Then the answer came almost immediately. She thinks it belongs to Daniel. Exactly. His voice sharpened slightly. She thinks. The emphasis wasn't accidental. I sat forward. What are you saying? I'm saying assumptions can be dangerous. I remembered the confidence in Vanessa's voice. The confidence in her plans. The confidence in her changes. The confidence in her certainty that my future had already been decided. A strange feeling stirred inside me. Not hope. Not yet. Something smaller. Curiosity. Martin. Yes? Does the house belong to Daniel? The silence that followed felt deliberate. Professional. Careful. Finally he answered. That's not the right question. My heartbeat accelerated. Then what's the right question? His reply came slowly. The right question is whether the house can be controlled the way they think. I stared at the phone. Every instinct told me he was choosing his words carefully. Very carefully. Can it? Another pause. Then, I'll explain when I've finished reviewing everything. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because Martin had inherited Richard's most frustrating habit. Giving half an answer. Then waiting. I hate when people do that. His chuckle echoed through the phone. So did Richard. For the first time in days, I laughed. A real laugh. Brief. Unexpected. Gone almost immediately. But real. After we hung up, I found myself walking through the house differently. Observing. Studying. Listening. Not as a victim. Not yet as someone fighting back. Simply as someone paying attention. The difference mattered. That evening, I noticed Vanessa measuring the living room wall. The next day, she discussed flooring samples with a contractor. 2 days later, she began talking about market value. Always casually. Always indirectly. Always as if the future had already been approved by everyone involved. Including me. One afternoon, I stood in the hallway while she spoke on the phone. She didn't know I was there. The house has amazing potential. A pause. Then, no, Danielle agrees. Another pause. A soft laugh. Once everything settles, things will move pretty quickly. I quietly stepped away before she could see me. Back in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Richard's letter. The paper felt worn already from how often I'd unfolded it. My eyes settled on one line. Don't let anyone rush you. At first, I thought Richard was talking about grief. Now I wasn't so sure. Because everywhere I looked, someone seemed to be in a hurry. A hurry to renovate. A hurry to reorganize. A hurry to discuss my future. A hurry to move on. And suddenly, for the first time since Richard died, a thought entered my mind that I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. What if Vanessa wasn't planning around reality? What if she was planning around assumptions? And what if those assumptions were wrong? That night, just before bed, my phone rang once more. Martin. I answered immediately. Martin? His voice sounded calm. Almost satisfied. The way Richard used to sound after solving a difficult problem. I finished reviewing the property records. My heart skipped. And? The pause that followed lasted only a second. But it felt much longer. Then Martin said, Margaret, the house may not be controlled the way they think. And for the first time since I was moved out of my own bedroom, I felt the smallest crack appear in Vanessa's certainty. After Martin's call, I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I felt tired. Not physically. Emotionally. For nearly 2 weeks, my mind had been running in circles. Richard's death. Vanessa's changes. The realtor. The estate documents. The warnings hidden inside Richard's letter. Now there was a new piece to the puzzle. The house might not belong to the future Vanessa had already imagined. But somehow, that wasn't the thought keeping me awake. Daniel was. Because the more I watched him, the less certain I became. It would have been easier if he were cruel. Cruel people are simple. You know where you stand. You know what they're capable of. You know what to expect. But Daniel wasn't cruel. At least, not in the way Vanessa was. That made everything harder. A few days later, I found myself sitting alone in the breakfast nook, staring out at the backyard. The sky was clear for the first time in over a week. Sunlight spilled across the grass. The hydrangeas were beginning to show signs of life. Tiny green buds pushed through bare branches. Spring was arriving whether I was ready for it or not. I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel. He carried a coffee mug in one hand and looked as though he hadn't slept well. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sat across from me. The same seat Richard used to occupy on weekends. The sight caught me off guard. Beautiful morning, he said. I nodded. It is. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just uncertain. Like two people standing on opposite sides of a river trying to decide whether to cross. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "How are you doing?" The question sounded awkward. Rehearsed. As if he'd been practicing it. I almost smiled. At 43 years old, my son still struggled with difficult conversations. "I'm managing." He nodded. Then stared into his coffee. I waited. Years of motherhood had taught me something important. People often reveal themselves if you stop filling the silence for them. Eventually, Daniel spoke again. "I know things have been strange." Strange. The word nearly made me laugh. Being moved out of my bedroom 6 days after my husband's funeral was apparently strange. I looked out the window. That's one way to describe it. His shoulders tightened immediately. There it was. The reaction I had begun noticing more often. Not anger. Discomfort. Daniel hated disappointing people. Especially when he knew they were right. The problem was that hating disappointment and doing something about it are two very different things. "I don't want you thinking nobody cares about you," he said quietly. The sentence hurt more than I expected. Because somewhere deep inside, I realized he actually believed that was the problem. Not the bedroom. Not the secrecy. Not the decisions being made without me. My feelings. Daniel thought the issue was emotional. Not structural. Not moral. Emotional. As if this were all a misunderstanding. I studied him carefully. The lines around his eyes looked deeper than I remembered. There was gray in his hair now. The realization startled me. When had that happened? When had my little boy become middle-aged? And when had I stopped seeing it? A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Daniel at 8 years old. Standing in our kitchen with tears running down his face because a classmate had been bullied during recess. Not Daniel. Another child. Daniel had cried because someone else was hurting. Richard later found him in the garage and asked why he was so upset. Daniel's answer had been simple. Nobody helped him. That memory stayed with me. Because that boy had grown into the man sitting across from me now. A man who still hated seeing people suffer. A man who somehow couldn't see what was happening right in front of him. Or maybe he could. Maybe that was the problem. "Daniel." He looked up. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." I hesitated. Then decided honesty mattered more than comfort. When Vanessa moved into my bedroom, his expression immediately changed. "Did you think it was the right thing to do?" Silence. Long silence. The kind that tells you everything before a single word is spoken. Daniel looked down at his mug. Then at the table. Then toward the window. "Anywhere. Except me." Finally, he answered. I didn't know how to handle it. The words landed heavily between us. Not because they were surprising. Because they were true. I could hear it. He wasn't defending the decision. He wasn't justifying it. He was admitting something else entirely. Weakness. I thought of Richard's letter. A good heart isn't the same thing as a strong spine. For the first time, I fully understood what Richard meant. Daniel wasn't choosing Vanessa over me. Not consciously. He was choosing the path that required the least confrontation. And Vanessa happened to be standing on that path. The realization brought no comfort. Only sadness. Because weakness can cause as much damage as cruelty. Sometimes more. I miss Dad. The words came out unexpectedly. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. For the first time since the funeral, I saw genuine grief break through. Not avoidance. Not guilt. Grief. I know. He rubbed his eyes. I keep reaching for my phone. I frowned. What do you mean? When something happens. His voice dropped. Good news. Bad news. Doesn't matter. He stared at the coffee in front of him. My first thought is always to call him. The ache in my chest deepened. Because I understood exactly what he meant. The world keeps creating moments meant for someone who's no longer there. And every one of those moments hurts. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel stood. I have to get going. Okay. He hesitated. Just for a second. As though he wanted to say something else. Then he nodded and left. The conversation stayed with me all day. Not because it solved anything. It didn't. Nothing had changed. I was still in the guest room. Vanessa was still upstairs. The house was still slowly becoming unrecognizable. Yet something important had shifted. For the first time, I stopped seeing Daniel as a villain. That didn't excuse him. It didn't erase the hurt. But it made the truth clearer. Daniel wasn't driving the car. He was sitting in the passenger seat pretending he wasn't responsible for where it was going. And maybe that was why Richard worried. That evening, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I wrapped Richard's gray cardigan around my shoulders and sat in bed reading one of his old mystery novels. The house was silent. Or so I thought. Then I heard footsteps. Soft. Careful. Moving through the hallway. I looked toward the door. A shadow appeared beneath it. Someone was standing outside. My heart quickened. For a moment, nobody moved. Then came a quiet knock. I set the book aside. Come in. The door opened slowly. Daniel stood there. He looked exhausted. More exhausted than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were red. As though he hadn't slept either. Neither of us spoke. The hallway light framed him from behind. For a strange moment, he looked exactly like the teenager who used to stand in my doorway after nightmares. Mom. His voice faltered. I waited. Whatever he had come to say clearly mattered. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked away. Then back at me. The silence stretched painfully. Finally, he exhaled. I should let you sleep. Before I could respond, he stepped backward. Daniel. He paused. But didn't turn around. I stared at my son's back. At the hesitation in his shoulders. At the guilt he seemed unable to put into words. Then he walked away. A few seconds later, I heard his bedroom door close. I remained sitting there long after the hallway went dark. Because in that brief moment, I had seen something important. For the first time since Richard died, Daniel looked afraid. And somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in this house was beginning to frighten him too. For the next few days, I said very little. Not because I had given up. Because I had started paying attention. There is a difference. Most people think silence means surrender. Richard used to say silence is often where the real work happens. You stop reacting. You start observing. And eventually, people reveal themselves. That was exactly what began happening inside my house. The less I argued, the more comfortable Vanessa became. The more comfortable she became, the less careful she was. By the second week after the funeral, she was no longer pretending every change was temporary. The language had shifted. At first, everything had been about helping me. Making things easier. Keeping me safe. Now. It was about plans. Timelines. Improvements. Future value. One afternoon, I found her standing in the living room with a contractor. I hadn't known anyone was coming. No one had told me. The contractor held a clipboard while Vanessa pointed toward the fireplace. I think removing those built-ins would open the room considerably. The man nodded. What about the flooring? We'll probably replace it. Replace it. I stared at the hardwood floors. Richard had installed those floors himself 20 years earlier. Every board. Every nail. Every weekend for nearly 3 months. I remembered bringing him lemonade while he worked. Remembered Daniel helping when he was home from college. Remembered Richard sitting in the middle of the unfinished room afterward, exhausted and proud. Now Vanessa discussed replacing it the way someone discusses changing a light bulb. The contractor noticed me first. "Hello." I smiled politely. "Hello." Vanessa turned. For a brief second, surprise crossed her face. Then it disappeared. "Oh, Margaret." Margaret. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Whitmore. Just Margaret. The way one speaks to a neighbor. "We're only gathering estimates." I nodded. "I'm sure you are." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Not because of what I said. Because of what I didn't." The contractor left shortly afterward. Vanessa remained standing near the fireplace. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. "Nothing is being decided." "Of course." Another pause. "You know how important planning is." I looked at her. Really looked at her. For years, I had focused on her confidence. Her organization. Her ability to take charge. Now I noticed something else. Control. Vanessa disliked uncertainty. She needed outcomes. Schedules. Results. People who dislike uncertainty often try to manage everything around them. Including other people. Especially other people. That evening, Daniel worked late. Vanessa spent most of the night on her phone. I could hear her voice drifting from the den. Occasionally she laughed. Occasionally she lowered her voice. The conversations lasted longer than usual. Around 9 o'clock, I went upstairs to retrieve a photo album from the hallway closet. As I approached the landing, I heard Vanessa speaking again. At first, I paid no attention. Then I heard one word. Listing. My footsteps stopped. The hallway was dim. Only a lamp glowed near the staircase. Vanessa stood inside the den with her back toward the doorway. She hadn't seen me. Her voice carried clearly. "The timing is perfect." A pause. Then, "No, Daniel's on board." My stomach tightened. Another pause. A soft laugh. "Honestly, the biggest issue is how long she'll want to stay." She'll. Not Margaret. Not Mom. She'll. I remained completely still. Years ago, Richard taught Daniel how to watch deer without startling them. The secret, he said, was becoming part of the landscape. Invisible. At that moment, I understood exactly what he meant. Vanessa continued. "The realtor agrees." The word hit me immediately. Realtor. Again. "The market is strong." A pause. "Then, if everything stays on schedule, we'll move much faster than expected." My pulse quickened. Move. Schedule. Faster. The language wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't a conversation about possibilities. It was a conversation about execution. I should have walked away. Instead, I listened. The assisted living communities have waiting lists. A brief silence followed. Then, exactly. My hand tightened around the stair railing. Assisted living. There it was again. Not concern. Not discussion. Planning. Detailed planning. The realization hurt less than I expected. Perhaps because some part of me already knew. When betrayal arrives slowly, the final confirmation often hurts less than the suspicion that comes before it. I quietly stepped backward. One step. Then another. Until I reached the guest room. Once inside, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From clarity. For weeks, I had been negotiating with reality. explaining things away, defending people who hadn't asked for defense, searching for innocent explanations. Now those explanations were gone. Vanessa wasn't considering options. She had already chosen one. The only question was how quickly she could make it happen. A strange calm settled over me. Not peace. Acceptance. The kind that comes after a long argument with yourself. I picked up Richard's letter from the nightstand. My eyes immediately found the same sentence. Don't let anyone rush you. This time I understood exactly what he meant. Because everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Vanessa. The realtor. The contractors. The plans. The future. Everyone except me. The next morning, my phone rang just after breakfast. Martin. I answered immediately. Good morning. His voice sounded different. Focused. Purposeful. The way a doctor sounds before delivering test results. My stomach tightened. Morning. I finished reviewing everything. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I sat down at the kitchen table. What does that mean? It means I finally have answers. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. After weeks of uncertainty, I wasn't sure I was ready for answers. Yet I needed them. Desperately. Martin. Yes? Tell me. A long silence followed. Then I heard papers moving on his desk. The sound seemed unusually loud. Finally, he spoke. Margaret, before I explain anything else, I need to ask one question. My heartbeat quickened. What question? His voice lowered. Careful. Measured. Serious. Has anyone asked you to sign any paperwork yet? I froze. Because suddenly I remembered something. 3 days earlier. A folder Vanessa casually left on the kitchen counter. A folder she quickly removed when she realized I was looking at it. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I wasn't so sure. Not yet, I whispered. Martin exhaled slowly. Good. The single word carried more weight than an entire conversation. I gripped the phone tighter. Martin. Yes? What did Richard do? The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Martin gave the answer I had been waiting for. And the answer changed everything. Margaret. He paused. Then continued. Vanessa has been making plans based on an assumption that isn't true. For the rest of that day, I couldn't stop thinking about Martin's words. Vanessa has been making plans based on an assumption that isn't true. He still hadn't explained the details. Not completely. Martin was frustrating that way. Richard used to joke that lawyers treated information the same way squirrels treated acorns. They buried pieces everywhere and only revealed them when absolutely necessary. But this time I understood why Martin was being careful. The less I knew, the less likely I was to react. And reaction was exactly what Vanessa seemed to be expecting. That evening, I sat alone on the back porch with Richard's letter folded inside my cardigan pocket. The air smelled of damp soil and fresh grass. For the first time all spring, the sun stayed out long enough to warm the old wooden steps. The hydrangea bushes along the fence were beginning to wake up. Tiny green leaves had appeared almost overnight. I stared at them for a long time. Richard loved those bushes. Every year he worried they wouldn't survive winter. Every year they came back anyway. Stronger than he expected. A sad smile touched my lips. Maybe people weren't so different. Maybe grief was winter. And maybe survival happened slowly. One small green leaf at a time. For nearly 3 weeks I had spent every waking hour trying to understand why this was happening. Why Daniel wasn't stopping it. Why Vanessa seemed so eager to move forward. Why I suddenly felt like a stranger in my own home. But sitting there on the porch, something shifted inside me. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. I realized I had been fighting the wrong battle. I wasn't trying to save my bedroom. I wasn't trying to save the furniture. I wasn't even trying to save the house. I was trying to save the version of Daniel I remembered. The little boy who cried when other children got hurt. The teenager who used to leave flowers on my kitchen counter every Mother's Day. The young man who called me 3 times a week after moving into his first apartment. I kept waiting for that version of Daniel to come back. To notice. To intervene. To choose me. And maybe that was why everything hurt so much. Because every day he didn't choose me felt like a new rejection. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Then something surprising happened. I felt relief. Painful relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop arguing with reality. Daniel was responsible for his own choices. Not mine. And I could not spend the rest of my life waiting for someone else to become who I wanted them to be. I sat there until sunset. When I finally stood, my knees ached. But my mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. That night, I began sorting boxes. Not because I planned to leave. Because I needed to remember. The guest room floor soon filled with photo albums. Old greeting cards. Family videos. School report cards. The artifacts of an ordinary life. I spent hours going through them. Some made me laugh. Others made me cry. Most did both. Near midnight, I found a small wooden box tucked beneath a stack of photo albums. I recognized it immediately. Richard's keepsake box. The one he used to hide in the closet. My breath caught. Carefully, I opened it. Inside were dozens of small items. Movie tickets. Postcards. A dried flower from our anniversary trip to Maine. A hospital bracelet from the day Daniel was born. Tiny pieces of a life that would have seemed meaningless to anyone else. To me, they were priceless. At the bottom sat a folded note. Richard's handwriting. Of course. I unfolded it carefully. The paper was yellowed with age. The note wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a sentence. A single sentence. Never mistake love for obligation. They are not the same thing. I stared at those words for a very long time. Then I placed the note beside me. Because suddenly I understood something Richard had figured out years before I did. Love cannot be demanded. It cannot be earned through sacrifice. And it certainly cannot survive forever if only one person is carrying it. The next morning, Vanessa found me in the dining room sorting photographs. She looked surprised. For weeks, she had grown accustomed to seeing me withdrawn. Quiet. Sad. Waiting. Now I was busy. Focused. Calm. The change seemed to unsettle her. "What are you doing?" she asked. I smiled. "Organizing." She glanced at the photographs. "That looks like a lot of work." "It is." A brief silence followed. Then she nodded. "Good." I looked up. "Good?" She shifted slightly. As hard as this sounds, moving forward is important. There it was again. Moving forward. The phrase she used whenever she wanted to justify. Leaving something behind. This time, however, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I simply nodded. And that seemed to confuse her even more. Because people who expect resistance often don't know what to do with peace. Later that afternoon, Martin called. "How are things?" "Quiet." Quiet can be useful. I smiled. Richard used to say that. Richard said a lot of smart things. The warmth in his voice made me laugh softly. Then he became serious. "The family dinner is still happening next weekend?" I frowned. "Family dinner? You don't know?" "Apparently not." Martin sounded surprised. Daniel called me this morning. My pulse quickened. Why? He asked if I'd be willing to stop by briefly. I sat up straighter. Daniel had called Martin? Without telling me? What exactly is this dinner? Martin paused. I'm not entirely sure. That answer immediately caught my attention. Martin always seemed sure. Always informed. Always prepared. Uncertainty sounded unusual coming from him. Did Daniel say why he wanted you there? Another pause. Then, he said it was time everyone sat down together. The words lingered. Time everyone sat down together. Interesting. Because until now, nobody had seemed interested in my opinion about anything. I walked toward the window. Outside, the hydrangeas moved gently in the wind. A strange feeling settled inside me. Not anxiety. Anticipation. Something was changing. I could feel it. The same way you can feel a thunderstorm building long before the first drop of rain falls. Margaret. Martin's voice pulled me back. Yes? When that dinner happens, I need you to do something. What? His answer came immediately. Listen more than you speak. I frowned. Why? A soft chuckle crossed the line. Because people reveal a great deal when they think they've already won. After we hung up, I stood by the window for several minutes. Thinking. Listening. Waiting. For the first time since Richard died, I wasn't focused on defending my place in the family. I wasn't trying to convince anyone to love me. I wasn't trying to earn kindness. Or understanding. Or respect. I was simply watching. And somehow, that made me stronger. That night, before going to bed, I opened Richard's letter one more time. My eyes landed on the sentence I now knew by heart. Don't let anyone rush you. I folded the letter carefully. Placed it inside the nightstand. Then turned off the lamp. For the first time in weeks, sleep came easily. Because deep down, I sensed something important approaching. The plans. The assumptions. The secrets. The questions. All of them were moving toward the same place. And next weekend, around a crowded family dinner table, someone was finally going to say the quiet part out loud. The family dinner was scheduled for Sunday evening. 3 days away. 3 days that felt strangely longer than the previous 3 weeks. Normally, I would have spent that time worrying. Rehearsing conversations. Preparing explanations. Trying to anticipate everyone's reactions. But something had changed. The need to defend myself was gone. In its place sat a quiet certainty I hadn't felt since Richard died. Not certainty about the house. Not certainty about the future. Certainty about myself. For the first time, I no longer needed anyone at that table to validate what I had experienced. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. And I knew how I had been treated. That was enough. Sunday arrived gray and cool. The kind of Connecticut spring day where clouds linger without committing to rain. I spent the morning doing something I hadn't done in weeks. I visited Richard's grave. The cemetery was nearly empty. A groundskeeper worked quietly near the far fence. Birds moved through the trees overhead. Everything felt peaceful. I stood beside the polished granite marker and rested my hand against the cold stone. Well, I said softly, it seems your letter was right. The wind stirred gently around me. I smiled despite myself. You always hated being wrong. The familiar ache returned. But it felt different now. Less sharp. Less desperate. More like a scar than an open wound. I stayed there for nearly an hour. Talking. Remembering. Listening to silence. When I finally returned home, the driveway was already crowded with cars. Family had arrived. Of course Vanessa would make an event out of it. She never missed an opportunity to create an audience. The moment I stepped inside, I heard voices. Laughter. The clink of dishes. The low murmur of conversations. For a brief moment, memories flooded back. Thanksgiving dinners. Christmas gatherings. Graduation celebrations. The house had hosted decades of family milestones. Today felt different. Not because the people were different. Because I was. My sister Elaine spotted me first. She crossed the room immediately and hugged me tightly. A little too tightly. As though she sensed something important was about to happen. "You okay?" she whispered. "I am." Surprisingly, it was true. She studied my face. Then nodded. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. Across the room, Vanessa stood near the dining table arranging place settings. Everything looked perfect. Of course it did. The candles. The flowers. The polished silverware. The carefully folded napkins. Vanessa excelled at appearances. That had always been her gift. She noticed me watching and smiled warmly. "Margaret." The smile looked effortless. Practiced. Almost affectionate. Almost. "Everyone's excited to see you." I nodded politely. "I'm sure they are." Something flickered behind her eyes. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. Because over the past few weeks, I had become a student of small expressions. Tiny hesitations. Brief flashes of irritation. The moments people fail to perform. Vanessa recovered immediately. "Would you like some tea?" "No thank you." Another pause. Then she returned to arranging the table. The performance continued. Relatives drifted in and out of conversations. Several offered condolences. Others shared memories of Richard. A few looked uncomfortable. The way people often do when they know tension exists but don't understand its shape. I spent most of the afternoon listening. Exactly as Martin suggested. Listening more than speaking. And the more I listened, the more I noticed. Vanessa kept steering conversations toward the future. Renovations. Property values. Lifestyle changes. Fresh starts. Daniel mostly nodded. Rarely contributed. Rarely disagreed. His silence had become familiar. But today something seemed different. He looked distracted. Nervous. Several times I caught him glancing toward the front door. As if waiting for someone. Or dreading someone. Around 6 o'clock, everyone gathered in the dining room. The same dining room where Richard and I had hosted family dinners for decades. The mahogany table looked beautiful beneath the chandelier. But one chair remained painfully empty. Richard's chair. No one sat there. No one suggested it. The absence spoke for itself. As conversation settled, I noticed Daniel checking his watch again. Then his phone. Then the front window. Finally, a doorbell rang. The room went quiet. Not completely. Just enough. Daniel stood immediately. "I'll get it." My pulse quickened. Because suddenly I knew. Martin. A minute later, Daniel returned. And Martin Keegan walked into the dining room behind him. The reaction was immediate. Surprise. Confusion. Curiosity. Several relatives greeted him warmly. Vanessa looked caught off guard. Only briefly. But the reaction was there. Then she smiled. "Martin." Her voice remained pleasant. "What a surprise." Martin returned the smile. "Good evening." At 68, he carried himself the same way Richard had. Calm. Measured. Impossible to rush. He greeted everyone politely before taking an empty seat near the end of the table. The conversations resumed. But the atmosphere had changed. Everyone felt it. Nobody mentioned it. The best family tensions are rarely spoken aloud. They settle into the room like weather. Invisible. Yet impossible to ignore. Dinner began. Roast chicken. Potatoes. Green beans. Dinner rolls. Normal food. Ordinary food. The kind families have served forever. And somehow, that made the tension feel even stranger. People discussed grandchildren. Travel plans. Work. Sports. Anything except the thing sitting quietly beneath the surface. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa raised her wine glass. I just wanted to say something. The room gradually quieted. She smiled. Poised. Confident. Exactly the way she always did before taking control of a conversation. These past few weeks have been difficult for everyone. Several people nodded. Richard meant so much to this family. More nods. Sympathetic. Murmurs. Vanessa's voice softened. But I think he'd want us to focus on moving forward. There it was again. Moving forward. The phrase had become her favorite tool. She continued. We all have difficult adjustments ahead. My sister shifted uncomfortably beside me. Daniel stared at his plate. Martin remained expressionless. Vanessa glanced toward me. Then back to the room. But families survive by making practical decisions. Practical. Another familiar word. A carefully chosen word. One that often sounds reasonable before people realize what it's hiding. The room remained quiet. Vanessa smiled. Confident. Certain. Certain she understood the future. Certain she understood the house. Certain she understood the estate. Certain she understood me. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then Martin reached calmly beside his chair. And lifted a leather folder onto the table. The sound wasn't loud. Just the soft thump of leather against polished wood. Yet every conversation stopped immediately. The room fell silent. Completely silent. Vanessa's smile froze. Not disappeared. Frozen. Martin folded his hands neatly on top of the folder. Then looked directly at Daniel. For the first time all evening, his expression became serious. Very serious. And in that moment, I realized something important. This dinner was never about moving forward. It was about truth. And the truth had finally arrived. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The dining room seemed suspended in time. The candles flickered softly. Silverware rested untouched on plates. Outside, the wind rattled the branches of the maple tree near the front porch. And at the center of it all sat Martin's leather folder. Quiet. Unremarkable. Yet somehow more powerful than anything anyone had said all evening. Vanessa recovered first. She always did. Her smile returned, polished and effortless. Martin? Her tone remained pleasant. Curious. Almost amused. What's this? Martin looked at her calmly. Something Richard asked me to address if it became necessary. The smile on Vanessa's face didn't disappear. But it lost some of its certainty. I noticed. So did Daniel. Across the table, my son sat completely still. Martin folded his hands. No need for alarm, he said. His voice remained even. Measured. Professional. The way a surgeon might speak before delivering difficult news. I'm simply here because several assumptions have been made recently. The word landed heavily. Assumptions. I saw Vanessa blink. Only once. Then she leaned back in her chair. What assumptions? Martin looked around the room. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just carefully. Making sure everyone understood the conversation that was about to happen. Finally, his eyes settled on Daniel. Your father spent a great deal of time planning for your mother's future. Daniel lowered his gaze. Martin continued. He did not leave things unfinished. A strange silence followed. One filled with realization. Richard had always been organized. Everyone knew that. The man kept 30 years of tax records in labeled folders. Of course he had planned. Of course he had prepared. The question was, prepared for what? Martin opened the folder. The sound of paper sliding across paper seemed unusually loud. Then he removed a document. I reviewed every estate record, trust document, property filing, and instruction your father left behind. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. Martin continued. Richard anticipated many possibilities. The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Then Martin looked directly at me. Margaret. Yes? His expression softened. This house was never intended to become a negotiation. A lump formed in my throat. He looked back toward the others. Nor was it intended to become an investment opportunity. The words hung in the air. Across the table, Vanessa's face remained composed. But her eyes sharpened. The way they always did when something moved beyond her control. Martin continued. Richard established protections years ago. Daniel frowned. Protections? Yes. Martin nodded. For your mother. My son looked genuinely confused. Not defensive. Not angry. Confused. That was when I realized something important. Daniel truly didn't know. Whatever assumptions had been driving this situation, they hadn't come from Richard. And they hadn't come from Martin. They had come from somewhere else. Someone else. Martin slowly removed another document. Richard was very clear about one thing. His voice remained calm. He believed Margaret should never be pressured into major life decisions while grieving. The room grew even quieter. I thought about the guest room. The realtor. The contractors. The conversations I was never meant to hear. Pressure disguised as concern. Richard's words echoed in my mind. Martin glanced down at the document. Then read aloud. No one is to make housing, financial, or property decisions on Margaret's behalf unless she specifically requests assistance. The sentence landed like a stone in still water. Nobody reacted immediately. Then my sister Elaine exhaled softly beside me. Daniel stared at the table. Vanessa looked toward him. For the first time all evening, uncertainty entered her expression. A small crack. Nothing more. But it was there. Martin closed the document. What matters isn't money. His eyes moved around the room. What matters is intent. Nobody argued. Because everyone understood. This had never really been about square footage. Or maintenance. Or safety. It had been about control. Who decided? Who spoke? Who mattered? Martin turned another page. There's something else. Daniel finally looked up. What? Martin hesitated. Then reached into the folder and removed a folded sheet of paper. My breath caught immediately. I recognized it. Richard's handwriting. Martin looked toward me. I think this belongs to Margaret. He handed it across the table. My fingers trembled slightly as I accepted it. The paper felt familiar. Old. Carefully preserved. I unfolded it. The room disappeared. The conversations. The tension. The uncertainty. Everything vanished. For a moment, it was only Richard's words. If you're reading this, then something has become difficult. That disappoints me. Not because families disagree. Families always disagree. What disappoints me is the possibility that grief has been mistaken for weakness. My eyes filled immediately. The room remained silent. Everyone waiting. Listening. Margaret spent 42 years helping me build a life. A good one. She deserves patience, respect, and the freedom to choose her own future. I paused. My vision blurred. I swallowed hard and continued. If anyone believes my absence reduces her value, they have misunderstood everything I spent my life trying to teach. Nobody moved. Across the table, Daniel's face had gone pale. Not with fear. With shame. The difference mattered. The house is only wood and stone. The family is what matters. And families are measured by how they treat their most vulnerable members. The final line nearly broke me. Take care of her. That is all I ever asked. Richard. I lowered the letter. The room remained completely silent. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that arrives when truth leaves people with nothing left to hide behind. Daniel stared at the table. Then at me. His eyes were wet. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him cry. Slowly, he stood. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, he simply looked at me. Then he shook his head. Once. A small, broken gesture. I didn't see it. His voice cracked. The room remained still. I kept telling myself we were helping. He looked down. Then back at me. But I didn't see what it was doing to you. A tear slid down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. I should have. The honesty in his voice hurt more than any excuse ever could. Because excuses create distance. Truth removes it. For the first time in weeks, Daniel wasn't hiding. He wasn't avoiding. He wasn't deferring to Vanessa. He was standing alone inside his own choices. And that takes courage. Late. Painfully late. But courage nonetheless. Vanessa remained silent. For perhaps the first time since Richard's death, she had nothing useful to say. No plan. No solution. No carefully crafted explanation. Because some situations cannot be managed. They can only be faced. Daniel took a slow breath. Then looked directly at me. Not past me. Not around me. At me. Mom. The word sounded different. Like he actually meant it. His voice trembled. I'm sorry. The room fell silent again. And in that silence, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. Hurt. Yes. Disappointed. Absolutely. But not angry. Because Richard had been. Right. The house wasn't the point. The point was whether people learned before it was too late. Daniel stood there waiting. Waiting for forgiveness. Waiting for absolution. Waiting for me to make everything easier. The way mothers often do. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. The frightened little boy. The grieving man. The mistakes. The regret. The damage. All of it. Then I folded Richard's letter carefully and placed it back on the table. And for the first time all evening, I spoke. Daniel. Yes? My voice remained calm. Steady. I hear you. Nothing more. Nothing less. Because some wounds deserve honesty. And some healing takes longer than a single apology. Across the table, Daniel nodded slowly. He understood. And for the first time since Richard died, so did everyone else. The house felt different after that dinner. Not immediately. Not dramatically. No thunderstorm. No slammed doors. No dramatic exits. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, the change arrived quietly. The way dawn arrives. Slow enough that you don't notice it at first. Then suddenly everything looks different. The morning after the dinner, I woke before sunrise. For a few moments, I lay still in the guest room listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The refrigerator humming. The heating system clicking softly. The wind moving through the trees outside. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. I sat up slowly and wrapped Richard's gray cardigan around my shoulders. The sleeves were beginning to fray at the cuffs. He always meant to replace it. Never did. I smiled softly. Some things become precious because they survive longer than expected. Others become precious because they don't. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. A pale ribbon of silver stretched across the horizon. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. I simply felt present. The grief remained. It always would. But grief had stopped feeling like drowning. Now it felt more like carrying a heavy suitcase. Still there. Still difficult. Just no longer impossible. A knock sounded at the door. Gentle. Tentative. I already knew who it was. Come in. The door opened. Daniel stepped inside. He looked nervous. More nervous than the night he came to my room and left without speaking. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he glanced around the small guest room. The boxes. The photographs. The life temporarily packed away. His expression tightened. I'm sorry. The words came quietly. Not rehearsed this time. Not delivered in front of an audience. Just a son speaking to his mother. I nodded. I know. A long silence followed. Then Daniel looked toward the floor. I keep thinking about Dad. So do I. He trusted me. The pain in his voice caught me off guard. I waited. He trusted me to take care of you. My eyes drifted toward the window. The sun was beginning to rise. I know. His voice cracked slightly. And I failed. The room fell silent again. There wasn't anything useful to say. Some truths don't require discussion. Only acknowledgement. Eventually, Daniel sat on the edge of a chair. I don't know how to fix this. For the first time in weeks, I saw complete honesty. No excuses. No explanations. Just uncertainty. And oddly enough, uncertainty was progress. Because certainty had caused most of this mess. I studied my son carefully. Then I smiled. A small smile. Not because everything was fine. Because healing had finally begun. You don't fix 42 years of trust with one conversation. He nodded slowly. I figured. But you can start. His eyes filled. He looked away quickly. The same way he did when he was a teenager trying not to cry. Some habits never disappear. That morning, Daniel helped me carry several boxes upstairs. Neither of us mentioned the significance. We simply did it. One box at a time. Photographs. Books. Keepsakes. Memories. The physical act felt strangely symbolic. Like rebuilding a bridge plank by plank. When we reached the master bedroom, Daniel stopped in the doorway. The room looked different than it had weeks earlier. Vanessa's decorative changes remained. But something else had changed too. The atmosphere. The certainty. The assumption that the room belonged to someone else. Daniel swallowed. Then quietly said, "You should be here." I looked around the room. At the windows. The dresser. The closet. The bed. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because I had one. Because that wasn't what this was. This wasn't victory. It was restoration. There is a difference. Vanessa moved into the guest room later that week. The decision happened without arguments. Without drama. Without scenes. In fact, Vanessa said surprisingly little. Perhaps because she finally understood something. The situation had never been about legal documents. Or property. Or ownership. It had been about boundaries. And once those boundaries became clear, there wasn't much left to debate. Our relationship never returned to what it had been before. I don't think either of us expected it to. Some fractures heal. Others become permanent parts of the landscape. You learn to live around them. Months passed. Spring became summer. The hydrangeas bloomed. Large blue flowers lined the front walkway exactly as Richard always loved. One warm June afternoon, I stood outside watering them. The garden hose coiled at my feet. Birds chirped from nearby trees. The neighborhood felt peaceful. Ordinary. A car pulled into the driveway. Daniel. He stepped out carrying groceries. Without being asked. Without making a production out of it. Just helping. The way family is supposed to. As he walked toward the house, our eyes met. A brief smile passed between us. Not forgiveness. Not completely. Something quieter. Trust beginning again. Slowly. Carefully. The only way real trust ever returns. That evening, after dinner, I sat alone in the master bedroom. My bedroom. The word still felt strange. Comforting. Necessary. The room looked much closer to the way Richard and I had kept it. Our photograph had returned to the dresser. His book sat on the shelf. His reading lamp stood beside the chair. And next to the framed wedding picture rested his antique gold watch. The one I had first seen hidden inside Vanessa's handbag weeks earlier. I picked it up gently. The metal felt cool against my skin. Richard used to wind it every Sunday morning. Without fail. A small ritual. One of thousands. I smiled. Then set it back down. The evening sunlight stretched across the floorboards he loved so much. The same floorboards Vanessa once wanted replaced. The same floorboards Richard installed with his own hands. The same floorboards that carried 42 years of memories. I sat quietly for a long time. Thinking. Remembering. Listening. Eventually, my eyes settled on Richard's final letter. The paper had become soft from handling. The folds worn. The edges slightly frayed. I read the last lines again. The house is only wood and stone. The family is what matters. For weeks, I thought I was fighting for my home. I was wrong. The house had never been the real loss. Richard was. The companionship. The ordinary mornings. The shared jokes. The life we built together. That was what I had been protecting. And suddenly I understood something beautiful. No one could take that from me. Not Vanessa. Not grief. Not time. Not even death. Because those years still existed. Inside every photograph. Every note. Every flower in the garden. Every creaking floorboard. Every memory. And inside me. The sun finally disappeared beyond the trees. Soft shadows filled the room. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the hydrangeas swayed gently in the evening breeze. Richard would have loved them. I rested my hand against the glass. And for the first time since the day we buried him, the house no longer felt haunted by absence. It felt filled with presence. His presence. My presence. Our life. A life no one had the power to erase. And as darkness settled quietly over the garden, I realized something I never thought possible. For the first time since Richard died, the house felt like home again.